Okay, welcome everyone. Let's get going. If you can take your seat, please. We are ready to go. Daniel. Okay. Welcome everyone. Welcome everyone. Second session. The note well applies here. So hopefully you're familiar with this already. If not, make sure you get familiar with this. Tips for joining. So please, if you are local, use the Meet Echo Lite client and make sure to log in because we don't have blue sheets anymore. So that's our blue sheets. That helps you also get into the queue. And please wear masks unless you are speaking. For remote, people make sure your audio and video is off unless you want to speak up. And please use a headset. This is the second official session, and we still have one more side meeting tomorrow at 2 o'clock. We've done those updates. This is Monday's agenda, and this is today's agenda. I'll be talking about JOT embedded tokens. Atul will be talking about fine-grained transactional authorization. Peter will be talking about cross-device flows, and Christina will finish it up with the client ID for anonymous clients. And on the side meeting tomorrow, we'll dig deep into fine-grained transactional authorization. We talk about security BCP, and there's one more topic that I'm forgetting right now, but make sure to attend that, to remember that. Yeah, SDJOT, thank you. Okay, let's get going then. Hopefully you can drive the slides for me on this. Yeah, it just. Yeah. Hello? Yeah. Okay. So I want to talk to you about JOT embedded tokens, or formerly known as multiple subject JOT. So Dick, Giuseppe, and I have been kind of digging deeper into this, and we want to give you a quick update on our current thinking. And unfortunately, we didn't have a chance to update the document yet, but we'll give you some update on what we are thinking right now, and hopefully we can get some feedback either now or later on. So next slide, please. So just some background. When we started working on this one, we had a number of use cases, and those use cases fell into two different categories. Use cases that require issuing multiple tokens from multiple issuers, and use cases that require issuing multiple tokens from one issuer. And we've tried to kind of address both those cases in one document, which made it really cumbersome, awkward, and not clear, confusing. So what we've decided to do is focus on one use case or one category of use cases, which is multiple tokens from multiple issuers. And we'll look into the other one in the future, maybe in a completely different document. Can you hear me clearly, guys? Next slide, please. So the goal is to be able to bind one or more tokens that are issued from multiple issuers into a new token and show the relationship between those tokens. Next slide, please. So why do we need this? There are a number of reasons. Audit trail is an obvious one. In some cases also, it's useful to use the information in those tokens to display information to the end user. And this is, I'll talk about an example of a telephony example that is useful in that case. And the third one is obviously evaluation authorization. Next slide, please. So in those use cases, the multiple issuers use cases, the tokens that could be issued, it could be an access token or an ID token. So the prime example for an access token that needs embedded tokens is a stir diverted call. So, and this is a telephony use case. So A calls B, and the call from B is directed to C. Sorry, somebody saying something? No? Okay. So A calls B, and the call from B is directed to C. So when the call is redirected from B to C, B will create a new token, embed the original token that was talking about A calling B, and send the new token embedded into the new issued token into C. So C will, when C receives that, will be able to see that the original call was between A and B, and now the call from A to C was redirected. So that's the use case, right? The other use case with the ID token is that hello use case that Dick is working on. And the idea there is you want to be able to link multiple claims from multiple or different issuers. For example, you can get the date of birth from one issuer and education certification, for example, from a completely different issuer. Next slide, please. So the current thinking is that we want to utilize the token exchange mechanism, which has all the tools that we need with just a little bit of a tweak. So in this case, we want to send a request to the AS with the original token and ask for a new token, but indicate to the AS to embed the token that we sent you in the new issued token. Next slide, please. So the response will be a typical token exchange response with the requested token, including the embedded token. Next slide, please. So to do that, we wanted also to define a new tokens claim. In this case, we defined a tokens claim that is a list of objects, and each object will have information about the new token. In this case, we're talking about a type to indicate the type of token and the token itself. So this is kind of a generic names or generic structure that will allow us to address multiple or different use cases. Next slide, please. So that's all we have. Again, we haven't had a chance to update the draft with all those details. There is still more details, technical details that we want to dig deeper into and define and make it clearer. But just wanted to give you a quick update on our current thinking, and if anybody has any comments, question, we're happy to hear it right now. Go ahead, Yaron.
I think over time there will be multiple different semantics for embedded tokens, and it makes sense to embed So to include the semantics, so something signifying whether it's something trusting something else or just a combination of two things and probably many other things. I'm not saying we should standardize semantics. I'm saying we should have it explicit in the token because you're signing it and you want to minimize confusion attacks.
Can you say more, a little bit more, like, can you give an example, for example? Just help me understand exactly what you mean by this.
It's really a question of use cases. I'm not sure I understand enough the different use cases you're looking at, but you probably don't want to have an embedded token that's used for one be used for a different use case.
Got it. Yeah, that makes sense. Thank you. Any other comments, questions? Who's on the queue there? Brian? Go ahead.
I haven't read the draft.
Well, it's not up to date, so.
That's why. Actually, I may have read the last one. I was just having worked a lot on token exchange, that jumped out at me, and it looked like you had an extra parameter to indicate the interest in the semantics.
Yeah, this is just a straw man proposal right now. We haven't dug deep into that. Well, yeah, if you have any comments.
I have just some thoughts about it because it jumped out at me. The intended sort of point of extensibility with token exchange, and I know it's kind of a mess, but the idea behind it was to use the token type as the indicator for that
Got it.
kind of ish stuff, and it's not perfectly clean. I know that, but I would look at that rather than adding additional parameters to maybe indicate both what you're asking for and what you get back.
Got it.
Just
Got it.
Consider.
Yeah. Thank you. That's very useful feedback. I appreciate that. Okay. That's all?
I think there's someone before me there.
Oh, who's before?
Robin?
Robin, go ahead. The audio working? Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Great. Yeah, Robin Wilton, speaking in a personal capacity. Just coming back to the comment from the floor just now about maybe not wanting a claim that was intended for one use to be repurposed for another one. Mm-hmm. I mean, I think experience in this whole area over the last 10 or 15 years tells us that you can't tell relying parties what to rely on. So, I mean, my instinctive reaction to that is don't worry about even trying to define the semantics because relying parties going to rely. I mean, you know, the canonical example is US Social Security numbers. Strict rules about what they may or may not be used for have no effect on who insists on having them and what they rely on them for. So don't sweat it is my advice.
Okay. Thanks, Robin. Who's in the queue now?
Yeah.
That's all? Is it?
Yeah. I didn't put myself in, but.
Oh, okay. Go ahead.
So because you're embedding the original token, you know, inside the new one that you're minting, essentially you're giving full control over that token to the recipient of that, you know, new token, right?
Right.
So, I mean, the semantics essentially becomes like you've completely delegated that token to whoever is receiving the new token with the embedded tokens, right? Mm-hmm. Because if there is any other way, like if there is any other restriction, then you cannot actually embed the token inside that.
Right.
You know.
Yeah. So. That's correct. Yeah. Okay, Kelly.
Yeah, my question is about whether this is intended to be within a single trust boundary as the term we're using in the fine-grained authorization or across trust boundaries.
Yeah, that's a good question. So we're talking about different issuers. So potentially we're talking about cross boundaries here in this case, right?
So if you embed a token generated by, say, one authorization server, how would it be parsed by a resource in a different trust boundary? Is that something you've thought about yet?
Yeah. So like the whole idea is exactly that. Like one identity or one issuer issued one token, that will embed it in a new token that was issued by a completely different issuer and then sent to
So you
that.
trust the outside token to, but then still you have to parse it, I guess, right? You have to understand.
Right.
And
You have to validate both, right?
All right, thank you.
Yeah. Okay. Any other comments, questions? Okay. Thank you very much. That was very valuable feedback. Appreciate that. Okay. Back here. And I think a tool.
Hi, everyone.
Do you want me to hand you the control or do you want me to drive the slides from here?
Yeah, you can drive it.
Okay.
There's not a lot of slides. Hi, everyone. My name is Atul Tulshibagwa. I have been working with a bunch of folks in this room on this fine-grained transactional authorization idea or requirement. And while we are not at the stage where we can talk about specification proposals, today I would just like to cover the work that that group has done and the charter that we have come up with. Right. Next slide, please. And since I didn't take my own pictures, I used a stock photo. So, yeah, I should have asked you. Yeah. So yeah, the motivation is we want to secure communication between microservices, both inside a single trust domain or a single VPC, if you will, and across trust domains, right? So this is so that if there is a software supply chain attack or other way in which a sort of VPC is compromised, you cannot have a elevation of privileges or you cannot have a impersonation of users within those, within that trust domain. And this essentially has to be based on standards because organizations are going to have, VPCs in different cloud platforms between on-premise and cloud platforms and stuff like that. So unless we solve this in a standards, open standards kind of way, we are going to be stuck with, crummy solutions that cannot easily cross boundaries of these cloud platforms. Next, please. There's a lot of work, prior work that has been done, and I will just touch upon each one of these. So the Netflix blog just talked about how they can mint tokens, which I think they call passports, that can pass through the system without the ability for anyone to alter them. And so that way you cannot have impersonation or you cannot have privilege escalation within a call chain. But this, of course, works within just one trust domain. And it also, as far as I know, does not protect the call chain itself. So you can actually take that token and use it somewhere else, and it'll just work. Athens is a sort of a Yahoo, Verizon open source project, and that it has these centralized and decentralized authorization capabilities. It is meant for the same application, but from the website, it wasn't very clear exactly how these things worked. So I'm going to just make a mention of it, and you can read up about it, later. George, I don't know. I didn't see George as an attendee remotely, but George has been active in this working group, and
He's there.
oh, he's there. Awesome. He presented in IdentityVerse 2020 a short-lived transaction tokens idea, which is JWT-based tokens that last a very short period of time, and that can embed the identity and authorization information, so that any service using that within that period of time can rely on that to identify the user and the authorization scope. It does not, again, bind the call chain to those tokens, So that's a potential limitation if we are interested in fixing that. Rifat just talked about multi-subject tokens, or I guess now it's called multi-issuer tokens. And then Kelly has just put in a proposal. I saw a draft being submitted just today, I think. But we talked at Kelly talked at IETF one in Philadelphia about token chaining. Basically, the idea is how do you cross boundaries between, let's say, trust boundaries, like between two different organizations or two different, cloud platform instances of the same organization. So you have an authorization server on one end and an authorization server on the other end, and you mint a token from the second authorization server for the outbound call to use, so that it can actually cross the boundary and be accepted in the next, trust domain. And then, I just presented in IETF 114 as well about the generic problem architecture, and we can go into that a little bit. So this is in general what we were thinking about as the problem architecture. And the idea here is that there are multiple VPCs, as you can see, and it could be the VPCs belong to the same organization. Like in this case, the VPC1 and VPC2 belong to the same organization. Or it could be that you're calling a third-party API, and that belongs to a different organization, but it could be that the data in there is of your own organization. So you want to make sure that none of these call chains essentially can result in a privilege escalation or a user impersonation within that sequence of events. And the different colored services, like the blue bubbles represent externally facing REST APIs that can be called by publicly sort of documented clients. And the yellow bubbles represent what I'm calling pass-through microservices. What that means is they need not necessarily need to know the identity of the user, but they can just pass that token through to a resource microservice, which actually needs the identity of the user. Right? So if, let's say, I'm writing a microservice that just aggregates information from different other microservices, I don't need to know who the user is, right? I can just pass that information to the resource microservice and then get back the data and then aggregate that and send my response back. And yeah, so that's sort of the general architecture that we've been working with. And so now let's come to the charter that we have defined. Next slide, please. Yeah. So we had a couple of workshops, or actually one workshop and one call after that. We had all these companies attend, and we've now got certain proposals to the existing charter. You can download the charter. I just put it up on our website, and you can download it from there. But other attendees may later add themselves. So next slide, please. So let's go into the what is in. Sorry, go ahead.
So when you say charter for an IETF group, or charter for what? Or charter for the work? Or?
It's charter for the work. We haven't. I mean, we expect the work to happen in OAuth. It's one possibility, right? But we haven't quite defined that yet. So. So we would like to cover in this work both interactive and batch invocations. So interactive is where the user is actually present, and a batch invocation is where something is acting on behalf of the user. And then there are invocations which could be synchronous, which means that the expectation is that the call will return in a short period of time, or it could be asynchronous, where it could take much longer. And there are trust boundaries. So these are like things like an on-premise installation that is then talking to a cloud service, or services within one cloud platform. Maybe it's the same organization's tenant in, just as an example, AWS talking to a tenant in Azure belonging to the same organization. So it's those are the trust boundaries that we are talking about. And we're just defining RPCs as something that is the actual call made between microservices. And the call chain is the sequence of events that result from an invocation at the top level, which could be a user, like an interactive invocation or a batch invocation. Right. Next slide, please. Right. So I'm not going to read this aloud, but this is the purpose of the group, right? We want to make sure that it provides, it can convey authentication without modification. It can provide least privileged fine-grained authorization. So the scopes that are defined for the call chain can be very fine-grained, and it can provide the context information required to, in an immutable sort of way, so that you cannot do things like, let's say, I want to put in a buy order for a certain stock. Something in the middle can't change that order value or the, the sort of the security that I'm buying. Yeah, so we want to limit the scope to basically just, providing the framework to communicate identities. That's one part of it, which is, how do you identify the same user when you're crossing a trust boundary, right? When you're, let's say, you're in a VPC that is in AWS, and now you want to go to a VPC that is in Azure. How do you talk about that same user on both sides, right? So that is just a framework for communicating the identity, not trying to define a new identity format or something like that, but just arriving at a convention of how we will identify the user. And there's some existing work out there, like in the IETF Sec Events Working Group, that we could use potentially for this purpose. And then we want to also provide a mechanism for securely communicating that identity and authorization information and the context information between services. And so what information are we talking about, right? So these are all the things that we want to make sure that the identity of the principal, invoking the call is preserved. We also want to make sure that the identity of the services that are in the call chain is preserved, and the authorization scope, as defined at the top level, but also if it was downscoped or modified along the call chain, that information should always also be present. And the context of the invocation should also be preserved, right? So that you cannot mutate what it is the call is about. So these are the pieces of information that we need to preserve along in the call chain as we go. Yeah.
So I think we allocated about 15 minutes. Do you want to kind of maybe a little bit wrap it up in a few minutes and see if there is some feedback?
Yeah, so we're going to have a little more discussion tomorrow.
Yeah.
So I think there's just one more slide that I want to.
Okay.
Let's skip this one. Let's skip this one as well. Let's skip this one as well. Yeah, so these are the things that we would like to discuss, right? So we want to discuss things like, the short-lived tokens or the efficiency considerations, because this is something that is going to have to go with every RPC between microservices. So it needs to be super efficient. How do we verify the call chain? And I think we've had some good discussions in the last few days over here. And so there is some clarity on some of this, but I think it'll be good to get opinions from everyone about, whether this is important or not important, and so on. So that's kind of, we'll be discussing some of those tomorrow. Would love to encourage people to participate.
Anybody has any thoughts at this stage? I don't see anybody in the queue.
All right.
So yeah, we're going to discuss this in a bit more details tomorrow.
Yeah.
So encourage people to join us tomorrow. Okay.
Right. Thank you.
Thank you, Atul.
Sure.
Peter. need to give you control here. Again, no, you should see it. Disappeared on me. Try to log in again. Oh, hey, again.
Here, did you give someone else control?
No, I'm okay.
So that's
Yeah.
so you give control there because that's me.
Yeah. Take slide control back. Take it back and
Yeah.
redo it or pass slide. Yeah.
Okay, let me take it back. I'll try it again. There you go.
Now it
Yes,
is.
something
Now
like
it was.
There you go. Yeah, just simple.
All right. Thanks everybody for coming this afternoon. I'm Peter, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about some of the cross-device flows. First, I just want to do a sound check. Can everybody hear me okay? Is the sound okay? Good.
So
Thank
you
you.
might want to adjust that, Mike.
There we go. Even better. All right. Okay, so I'm going to talk about cross-device flows. I think this is a topic that we've discussed at a number of venues, and I'm going to give a little bit of an update on the progress that we've made, and also just a recap for folks who may be new to the topic as well.
Peter.
Okay.
Here.
Oh,
Yeah.
oh, I didn't need to look back. Thank you.
Yeah.
I'm blind. All right. So there was a challenge, right? You have to take a picture locally, and this is mine, Mind the Gap. And it's actually kind of topical for this presentation because it turns out there's a couple of gaps that we need to pay attention to. And maybe we just need to put a label up, or maybe we also need to do a little bit more. So first of all, right, I'm going to talk very quickly just about the problem as a recap, a little bit about our journey so far, how we're thinking about managing this risk, some proposals. I'm going to talk a little bit about the draft proposal that was circulated maybe 2.5 weeks ago. And then I think a question for this room and for this audience is, what do we do next, right? Where do we go next with this work, if anywhere? Okay, so one of the things I want to maybe just start with is just this idea of an attack and where do these attacks on the identity systems come from. And so if you look at this graph, it's kind of interesting, right? There's sort of an entry point right at the start, which often involves social engineering, etc. And then there is a couple of other entry points, brute forcing and also exploiting the protocols itself. And one of the things I think that we often do, or one of the places where we put a lot of focus, is really this space here, right? We think and we spend a lot of time thinking about how an attacker could exploit the protocol from a technical perspective. However, I think one of the things that we've been learning over the last 2 years or so is that attackers are, because of the really good work that people in this room and elsewhere have done, attackers are actually sort of not going for the difficult problem of attacking the protocol as such. Oh, come on. They're focusing here, right? They're focusing on the social engineering side. And this is kind of, part of that mind the gap, right? All our attention is going into making sure the technology and the protocols are secure. And I think that's great. But it's leaving some of these social engineering gaps. And some of them are, implementation issues, but it's also sometimes, I think we've observed some of these as sort of unintended or unexpected, right? It continues to be surprising that people are surprised that this is a problem. And so an area or a gap that we might want to focus on a little bit more. So very specifically, I think one of the flows that we've been looking at is the device authorization grant or device code flow. And so typically how that works is on the one end, right, you have an attacker who controls a device or is able to connect to the authorization server, and they can initiate a session. They can then get hold of a user code or a QR code or something like that, and they change the context before they present it to the user. And so really what they're doing here is they're exploiting an unauthenticated channel between two devices, right? The place where the session gets initiated and the place where a user is consuming it. And they're incredibly creative, right? It is things like click to win, or you know, sign in, or we're going to delete your SharePoint site, or you know, any other number of things that creates anxiety, a sense of urgency, and get the user to say yes. There's other variations of this where it actually gets coupled with timing, or just spamming people, right? Just giving people, you know, you get notifications at 2 o'clock in the morning every 5 minutes to authenticate or authorize a transaction, and eventually somebody says yes, right? So there's sort of a user experience issue there. So of course, once the user has done this, they end up they get this. They're going to click to win because today's the day, right? And they scan and they enter that code. They perform their authentication authorization, and this can be strong auth, right? Or it can be multi-factor or FIDO. Doesn't matter, because with this attack, as the attacker, I'm not after your credentials, right? It's not a traditional phishing attack. I just want you to say yes, because what I really want is for you to say yes so that I can access your tokens, your access token, your refresh token, and then I can leverage those sometimes to do a lateral attack to a different, you know, I can sort of move across, or even just if I have access to your mailbox, right? That's already plenty, because now I can start sending mail on behalf of you. I can request additional access, right? I think we're seeing attackers being really, really clever, and not really attacking the technical aspects of the protocol, but using this sort of soft entry point with users. So really to recap, you know, start off by initiating the session, some social engineering technique to rephrase what's happening for the user, and you end up bypassing strong authentication, multi-factor authentication, and you're in. You know, I think one of the things that we do, and I'm sort of laying a challenge down to people on this one, especially folks working on formal analysis, etc. We model the user, right? When we design these protocols, we sort of expect perfection from the end user. They're going to make good judgments. They're going to be smart about when they say yes or no to things. But the reality is it doesn't work, right? And I think some of the recent attacks where I believe, you know, a large company suffered an attack, and the attack ended up being, I think, against part of their security organization, right? So even people who are security professionals end up being caught out by these attacks. And so the reality is, right, I think we need to find a way, and we need to accept that this is happening, that there is a person, a human on the other end that's going to make bad decisions, and we should just be thinking more about how we design for that as well. And so this work has really sort of been teasing out about what could we do in that space as well. So, you know, just in summary, really these are attacks in the cross-device sense that we're seeing. That's about exploiting this unauthenticated channel. This idea that the user is going to make good decisions, right? We sort of not abdicate, but we give responsibility to the user, and they malfunction, right? They make errors, they make mistakes in their decisions. I think the other thing that's come out as I started looking at this is that this is not just device authorization grant or device code flow was the first place we started seeing these attacks. But as we sort of dug in, right, there's plenty of other cross-device flows. And so the question is also, how do we take some of this learning and apply it, and how do we think about those other protocols, and how would that, how can we apply the learnings, but then also are some of these other protocols actually better replacements? So far, it's about just over maybe 12 months ago that we sort of started digging into these attacks. Last December at OSW, we sort of brought this to the community for the first time. We described the issues we were seeing and sort of tried to get a sense of other people are seeing it. In Vienna, we had a similar presentation, really just getting a gauge as their interest. At the time, there was quite a bit of interest from people, and a few folks came up and said, yes, they want to sort of help explore this problem. At OSW 2022 in Identiverse, we really spent, in fact, OSW in particular was an extremely productive set of discussions around the problem. And it really helped me and everybody else understand more around the challenges, the potential mitigations, and the breadth of the problem. So I really want to thank everybody for their contributions there. And then I think the previous IETF, I gave an update, and I think one of the questions was, well, okay, so where's the write-up? And so actually we went off and did that. So with Daniel and Philip, we ended up creating this framework. So sort of thinking about our approach in terms of practical mitigations, looking at alternatives, and okay, what do we need to do in terms of some of the foundational underpinnings. And we ended up writing this proposal. So what's in the draft proposal, right? I think to start with, we actually took some time to describe some of the concepts behind the cross-device flows, as well as the scenarios. Where are they getting used? There's quite a few of them. We sort of picked 6. You know, I think one of the things that I wanted to be thoughtful about in providing examples, we don't want to provide too many, but also not too few, because one of the things I've discovered working with engineers is they often only read the examples, right? They read the example to figure out, does this apply to them? And so there's sort of a number of these in there to try and sort of give an idea of the breadth, right? So if somebody reads this, they can see, yes, I have the scenario, no, I don't, or I have something like that, right? So that's kind of the intent. We've actually, since publishing, there's been 2 additional use cases that folks have brought to us after reading the document. So I think one of them's already been added in the next iteration, and there's another one that we need to discuss a little bit more. So that's kind of the tee up in the document. We've also ended up sort of coming up with a list of mitigation. So I think we're at what, I'm trying to quickly count, I forget now, I counted them last night, I think 12, 10. We've got quite a good number of mitigations. They're all described in terms of whether they're preventative, you know, do they disrupt the attack, do they help you recover, right? Because I think that was the other thing that we looked at. If we only try and prevent the attack, it sort of ignores the fact that the user is ultimately going to make a bad decision. So how can we disrupt it once it's in flight? And even when it's completed, right? What can we do in terms of recovery? So we got these, what's it, 2, 4, 6, 8, 10 mitigations that's described. And since publishing this, I've been approached by 2 individuals who had 2 additional mitigations that they recommended. And so I folded those into a future draft, and we will be making that available as well. So that's the mitigations. The other piece is just looking at alternative in terms of protocols, and so giving guidance. So the guidance that we're trying to give is, you know, there are alternatives out there, right, to the device authorization grant, and there are different sort of trade-offs, right? Some of these are more susceptible than others. Some of the mitigations are more relevant than others. And some of them are putting some requirements on the devices involved, right? So if we look at the FIDO2 WebAuthn, which in my view is one of the, you know, that's just one of the best mitigations that you can have for a cross-device flow because of how it's pretty, it comes across pretty secure. But for that, you need fairly high-spec devices that support the protocol. You need Bluetooth, etc., right? And so that may not always be available, but we sort of try and give some recommendation based on the problem space that you're in, based on the risks that you're facing, and based on the capabilities that you have in your solution, which of these would be applicable. Then I think also just a nod to the foundational pillars. I think one of the things that we're sort of, there isn't really a great, there's been some work around how to model poor user decision-making in security protocols, but it hasn't really been applied in this space. And I think that's sort of a challenge that we all want to put out there is, what can we do to make that actually more, how can we have more robust formal analysis to know if the mitigations we're deploying is actually going to make a difference. So I think that's everything. The purpose of this document, and I should have said that earlier on, the purpose of the document is really to provide guidance to implementers, to system architects, even to security professionals, so that when they're faced with a scenario, they have a little bit more information and they can make better decisions about how to think about the protocols, how to think about the problem space, and how to think about managing their risk, even though we cannot fully retire it. And then the other part is just maybe offering alternatives, right? Sometimes these cross-device flows are better served by a different protocol than the device authorization grant, or in some cases, I think one of the notes or feedback that we got when I first sent this out was, maybe we should also call out that if you're on, you shouldn't do cross-device protocols on the same device, right? That's also not a great practice, right? You should avoid those kind of things. So it's kind of obvious stuff sometimes, but calling that all out. Yeah, and so I think the question that I have for this group and for folks online, like what next, right? So we've written this document up. We can continue to evolve it. I also want to get a sense of whether this is actually useful to people, right? Is this a part of the problem space that is worth paying attention to? Do you find that valuable? Or not, right? And so basically getting feedback on the work, the problem space, and ideas about how we progress this work going forward.
Yeah, thanks, Peter. Anybody has any thoughts about this? Come on, there must be some thoughts here. There you go.
Well, actually, thanks, Justin.
Go ahead. You were about to say something.
No, I was going to start asking the audience questions, but I'll let you answer first, and then I'll ask the audience a question.
Gotcha. Yeah, sorry, I couldn't find the button.
That's fine.
Yeah,
keep going.
Justin Richer, I just wanted to say, first off, I think this is really important work. I think that this is a space in the security of these protocols that often gets overlooked because we just kind of say the user needs to make good decisions, and if they don't, we're kind of stuck. But a lot of what we deploy is about helping the user make the right decisions or removing those decisions in cases when the user shouldn't have those decisions. Yeah. I mean, that's practically that's a lot of what we're building out in that experience, in that space. Do you think that part of this work from the BCP, we might start getting close to, I hesitate to say it, but standardizing the UX for user-involved decisions? This would be important for both cross-device and same-device type of situations. So in a same-device situation, I'm being asked to, I'm being fished to click on a link, and it just goes back to my browser, and then like it still works for the attacker in some cases.
I would the word standardized might be
it's
sort
too
of
strong a word, but
too
yeah.
strong a word. I think we want very consistent user experiences around this.
Okay.
I think about, and John Bradley can probably comment about this, but I think some of the things that's really attractive about the WebAuthn 502 cross-device flow is it's a pretty consistent user experience, right? Almost independent of device, etc. Right? There is a good bit of consistency across platforms, and I think what I would say, strong guidance, but also then turning that guidance into requirements, right? So I would also turn around to the to people who are deploying the systems, right? turning that guidance into, and I at least have this expectation in terms of the user experience, rather than trying to say, well, the pixels need to be rendered in a certain way and a certain color and the buttons need to be in a certain place. Maybe I don't know if we can,
Right.
I have low expectation of success going that far.
No, I mean, so that would be more legislating the UI as opposed to the UX.
That's a great point, of course. Yeah.
And so I think we might actually be able to do some things on the experience side. There is an entire community of user experience research out there that we might honestly want to tap into for this, because we are specifically talking about things that are touching users.
Which community is that, by the way? So if you
I'm thinking of the lab at Carnegie Mellon Cups, I think is the first one that comes to mind. I know Bentley's got a big UX department as well, that they've done a lot of work in the past. I am whatever the Internet 2 group that was doing it, like there was a whole multi-year thing about specifically about authorization UX in that case. I mean, so that there's a lot. It's in the academic space. It's like, very ivory tower at the moment, but maybe we should start throwing some ladders against the tower and see if they'll help us.
Good idea.
Yeah, I'd be for that. And, I think there's plenty of us here who work with teams that have user experience capability as well. And I think having a proposal that they can react to and interact with would be fantastic. I would really welcome that. So Justin, if we can talk about how we do that, but I'd love to bring that and maybe use this document to anchor that. And maybe that, it turns into additions to this document or another document, but let's start doing that.
That's a really great point, to have something concrete to say, this is what we were thinking of, instead of just make it better. So
yeah. And maybe that's a place to start, right? We can share that document and say, this is the problem we're facing. UX researchers, how would you solve, right? Yeah.
All right. Thank you.
Awesome. Joseph.
Joseph Heenan, Authlead. I don't think I have anything terribly insightful to say, but I've read this document. It's a good document. I've provided a bit of feedback. I've referred people to the document and I believe they've read it and found it helpful. I've seen other people refer people to this document, so I think there's interest. I would say we should probably kind of take it forward to adoption and try and get more eyes on it and more input.
Thanks, Joseph.
Thanks, Joseph. George.
Yeah, I think it's probably already been said, but design patterns, I think, make a ton of sense, in the sense of making clear what the critical factors are. And I think that information into the design teams will be super helpful. I think they might not have the understanding, they're looking at it purely from a user experience, right? And to have some guidance we can give that says, here's the implications of making these kinds of choices, would be super helpful to those teams. And I think they would really appreciate it.
Thanks, George.
Awesome. John.
So I think this is good work. Couple of observations. The WebAuthn thing that you describe as the cross-device flow, currently called hybrid, formerly called cable, is not a thing like the others. It really is a different beast, in that what you're doing is it's analogous to, you wouldn't say that plugging a security key into a Windows computer and using WebAuthn to do OAuth from the Windows computer was a cross-device flow, and cable hybrid really is just a transport piece that replaces the USB. So it may confuse people to describe it as cross-device. I think we have to be a little bit careful about that.
Yes, I take the point, John. Maybe you can, so Tim Capelli actually authored that part of the document. I think I kind of took a step back. I know as technologists, we understand that what's really happening is we actually establish proximity through that hybrid protocol. And
well,
so,
then
it's a transfer, right? So
well,
you're not continuously
it's more than
doing
just
that.
proximity, though. Yeah.
And so I'd love your feedback on the text that Tim contributed. The reason it's in there is it is a way in which I can use this device with a device like a PC. It is a way, there are two devices involved. And sometimes that's really what the system designer is trying to achieve.
Right, but you're not doing the OAuth flow from your, so it
yes.
looks the same from the user. It is a better user experience, but from a protocol level, it's completely different.
I appreciate and understand. And I think if there's here's my other motivation here, John, is one, I really want to steer people towards, if you have a scenario that can be met by FIDO and with the WebAuthn flow, please use that rather than one of these other flows, right? And I think that's kind of my motivation for including it there. And if there's a better way to do
support cable, and Microsoft has no excuse for doing weird, funky cross-device things.
You may
well, it has lots of excuses. It doesn't necessarily, they're not good ones. But devices supporting FIDO either through directly a USB connection or hybrid would be a better solution to this weird cross-device OAuth thing. And if we go back to SIBA, God help me, when I started off doing that with the telephone companies, it was cross-device because it was to a call center. So when phone companies distribute a app to the SIM card so that they can remotely authenticate the user over the phone, they wanted a way to now and do OAuth or do OpenID Connect to relying parties based on a push notification, the regular sort of flow. They also said, okay, well, now when people call into a call center, we want to use the same mechanism, but clearly you can't do OAuth easily over the telephone in a voice call. So that's kind of the origin of it. It was never really intended to be used with a QR code with both legs of the protocol on the network. But once you open the can of worms, people use them for lots of things.
Yeah, so a couple of, I couldn't possibly comment on Xbox. And your other point that you're making, I think these protocols get designed and we have very specific use cases in mind for them. But once you open Pandora's box, right, I've been reflecting on this a lot, right? It is, it's like telling people not to covet their neighbor, right? It's like invariably something happens and people make a choice that they shouldn't have used the protocol in that way, right? Sort of almost like you're dealing with human nature in that way. But yeah, and again, I'd appreciate any feedback on how I do want to use this opportunity with this work to advance the good work that's happening in FIDO and WebAuthn. I appreciate that it is not a traditional cross-device like SIBA or device authorization grant, but there is sort of a commonality in that experience that might be a hook for people to transition to something more secure. That's the intent.
Right. We just have to figure out a way of describing it so that they understand that it's quality.
I would love that feedback.
So John, before you leave, so do you still think that this is a useful work that we should continue?
Yes, I think it's a useful work.
Perfect.
But there are some subtleties in how we explain this.
Okay.
So people ought not to think, yes, because hybrid or because cable hybrid is secure, that immediately can be transitioned over to. That's a different, doing WebAuthn over that kind of transport is a different thing than trying to do multi-device OAuth.
Okay.
And
again, please, if you have suggestions about how we do that, if the right answer is we shouldn't have that in the document, that's fine too. But I do want to make this opportunity to at least leave it with the implementers that there are better options that they could use if they need to authenticate and authorize.
Being in there, but separating that from multi-device OAuth. Say you can do, in the case where you're using multi-device OAuth, why don't you just do OAuth with the normal redirect flows, but do multi-device through the authenticator?
That's
So
Okay, so
yeah,
so
it happens
that's
at
what
a
I
different
want.
level.
That's I
Yeah,
think you
that's
just
good
said
enough.
what my intent is. If that I'm not expressing that, help me.
Okay.
Thank you.
Yeah, exactly. So thanks, John. Appreciate that. Aaron.
I'll just be really quick since we're like out of time. I just wanted to say I also think this is important work. This is great. Good start on the document. And I also agree that the user experience side of it is worth pursuing and documenting. I think that's something that has been very much missing from a lot of the work that we've published. And interestingly, it has come out mostly the same when people do implement it, both the device flow and just traditional OAuth consent screens. If you look at what's out there, there are a lot of commonalities, and that tends to be a good opportunity to actually document them as a standard. So I don't know exactly what the right way to do that is, but
I don't know if it's a standard. It's a BCP, but
it is a BCP is a standard. It's a type of standard.
I don't know.
It's
Anyway.
but I do think there's something there too, because it is also a question that is very commonly asked as someone is starting to build these: is what do I put on this screen? How should it work? And then it's kind of they kind of just have to figure it out, or go read someone's book. So I'll leave it with that.
Thanks, Aaron.
And Aaron, would you be open
Christine.
to sort of adopting this? Should we be adopting this as formal work in the working group? Yeah.
Christina.
Hi, Christina Suda. I'm just +1, great work. I'm gonna react to what you said, Peter, when you said don't use cross-device protocols and same device flows. Turns out it's not as simple as that. It's just only thing I wanted to quickly say. And maybe the comment is not exactly relevant if the protocols you're picking up in the document are, can only be usable with cross-device flows. But the protocols I'm working on, for example, the cross-device mechanism can also be applied in the same device environment. And we are observing people doing that. Like, for example, the request encoded in the QR code is also in a deep link. So user has an option to actually click it on the same device, for example, right? So I don't know exactly how relevant it is. And I've read the document. I haven't seen anything around that. So probably adding a text or clarifications or having a discussion would be useful, because again, like initially, at least in our protocols, the guidance was absolutely do not use cross-device for the same device. People are doing it, and people are doing it also for some legitimate reasons. Some deployment models do not allow to have token endpoint, whatnot. Some, like device, the response is too big, and they want to benefit from cross-device HTTP post requests, whatnot. So yeah, just bring it up.
No, thanks for that, Christina. I think that comment was actually added, Joseph, based on feedback that you gave. And so it's in the next draft. I'll actually, if you want to review that, but I want to know about those use cases. And you're right? We can say, don't do it. People, it's not going to prevent them. So we need to have mitigations, or we need to give people options, or at least highlight the risks with that.
Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, I've stolen time
Peter.
from a tool, so I'm going to go now.
No, hold on. That's good. Peter, are you aware of any, like there are specific solutions endorsed, and so are you aware of any IPRs on those? Because I checked the document, it didn't say anything, but it would be important to file if you are, it's like, these are the types of documents I would normally assume that they could be impacted.
I'm not aware of any IPR, Hannes. I'm not aware of any IPR.
Okay, awesome. So as chairs, we think we see lots of interest and support for this work. I didn't see anybody objecting for the work group to do that. So what we think, we're gonna call for adoption on the mailing list. Okay.
Thanks, Rafat.
Awesome.
And should I just do an update of the doc before you do that?
Yeah, that would be great. Yeah.
Okay, I'll do an update and then we do that.
Awesome.
Brilliant. Thank you.
Thank you, Peter. Christina. Is this the right document?
Yeah, this is the right document.
Okay. Do you want me to pass the control to you? See if that works.
Oh, wow. Yeah, it works. This is great.
Awesome.
All right. Hi, everyone. So the point of the presentation is to draw the working group's attention on how the client ID is being used and what can we, note some emerging data points, emerging patterns, and hopefully to start a conversation, what can we do about it? So if you look at section 2.2 in RC 6749, it clearly says it is authorization server who issues the client ID. And also if you go back to section 2, it says the client has to register with authorization server before initiating the protocol. So there are clearly two requirements that we have that are probably not always exactly followed in some of the deployments we are seeing. So just a couple of limitations, use cases I'm familiar of, and I've heard from the rooms that there are actually other use cases that do not exactly follow these two requirements. So one is OpenID for verifiable credential issuance protocol we've been working on. And I should say, I'm here presenting it, but this is kind of result of a long discussions with Torsten and Tobias, who are not in the room, but yeah, again, so huge kudos to both of them to contributing. So in the protocol, it is based on OWASP 2.0. If it has OpenID in the title, we just keep calling it OpenID for because we're talking about user claims, but it is OWASP based. Essentially, we defined a new resource server just for those in the room who are not familiar with the protocol. So this is a use case where there are a large number of relying parties, they call them wallets, a large number of these credential issuers who have built this additional resource server that want to interact with each other. And we've received a lot of feedback that it's unrealistic and also impractical for these relying parties / wallets to separately register with every single credential issuer and manage client IDs for each of those issuers. So, and that's kind of one extreme is this completely open ecosystem where, people want to allow any wallet to talk to any credential issuer. But of course, people would say, how about high assurance use cases, right? That's where it's kind of close to the second point with open banking and education federation and whatnot, where it's a relatively closed ecosystem, meaning there is some kind of third party managing, the requirements. Either it's a trust list or, like you have to have the certification. But in the end of the day, the point that there's a group of relying parties who are wanting to interact with another group of authorization servers is the same. And again, the same feedback coming in, like we don't want to manage client ID for each issuer separately from each authorization server in this case. So this is partially what we started calling anonymous clients. Maybe not the best term, but that's what we mean. When the client, the ranked party is coming in previously unknown to authorization server. So it's bringing in the client ID, which authorization server has not issued itself. And maybe it's not pre-issued per section 2. So yeah, I think I covered both kind of completely open ecosystem, a bit, more close ecosystem, but still two groups of parties interacting. So the two questions I really want to challenge people to think about is who should be determining the client ID and who should be managing the client metadata. And we'll come back to it, and just to give food for thought, I want to give some data points, or I want to call it prior art because it's kind of current art. So one thing is what I took a liberty to call client ID as a URI, or bring your own client ID model in existing OpenID Federation spec. So essentially, Trust and Tobias and I think that this mechanism defined in OpenID Federation is much more powerful than the authors themselves have intended or wanted to be. And it's interesting because first, this specification absolutely breaks section 2 and section 2.2 of RC 6749. And this is where a third party so there's no pre-registration as per section 2. So the client does not have to pre-register, and it is a client who is determining its own client ID. It's literally the client saying, here's my client ID. It's a URI. I panned the .well-known/openly federation config. You find the JSON file, use it as a client metadata, or you can go up the trust chain if it's, the closed environment I talked about, verify the trust chain, and make sure you can trust the metadata. Sorry, I'm like summarizing, I don't know, 100 pages in one sentence. So apologies for that. But so that's what it does, right? And I just put example of that, like example of client metadata managed by the client. And the same model actually have been pretty independently developed in the STIOP2 and OpenID for VP. So again, OpenID for VP is OWASP 2.0 based. We still call it OpenID because, again, it's about client identifier, and it's really close to the issuance extension. So this is where we actually allowed 3 different options to counter the limitations we faced. So one is we said, it's okay for client ID to equal redirect URI if you don't know what client ID to use. But not many people do. It's the simplest, but not many people do it because of, where do you get the metadata from? And the answer to that question is we defined a new parameter called client metadata, where you can, so in OpenID Federation example, the client metadata was hosted somewhere externally, but we also enabled an option to actually pass the actual client metadata in the authorization request, right? As long as that request is signed, or you have some additional mechanisms to trust that request or origins coming from, it's okay to take out the metadata from the actual authorization request, right? So those are the 3 options we have right now. And I think Tobias sent a note to an email, but there is a draft, individual draft on to kind of bringing that client metadata idea into the OWASP working group. But I'm kind of running ahead of myself, but I think if we can find a mechanism to combine this client metadata in the authorization request idea with a powerful mechanism OpenID Federation spec is giving us, we're actually creating something really powerful. But obviously, yeah, just to comment on the asterisk, obviously we are enabling pre-registration too, just to, so people are not having heart attacks. So, and recently what happened was, so I'm going back to the credential issuance draft. So that's where we actually defined a new grant type, which is really similar to job bearer grant type, but there's no authorization endpoint, and you can take, the token directly to the token endpoint. And that's where we talked to Brian Campbell, so we're not doing something completely crazy. We said it's okay not to pass client ID in the token request. So the client is pretty much anonymous. So obviously, if the authorization server wants to identify the client, it can return an error, say, hey, yup, so they need to bring the client ID. But spec-wise, we're saying the client can be completely anonymous. You don't have to send the client ID to the token request if you're not even doing authorization request, right? And I can't put it on the slide, but my actual motivation to bringing it up, because there's some really interesting but might be dangerous workarounds happening. And what I mean is, all those data points I've given are great, but the limitation is that existing authorization servers, existing ones, right, probably can't do it because they've implemented RFC 6749. They have to spit out their own client ID, and they right now do not allow bring your own client ID model. And hopefully in the future they will, but that's the status quo. And before we go to the future state, what these authorization servers are starting to do, because they have to spit out the client ID. So they do, and they publish it somewhere or communicate out of band, and they're telling the clients who want to support a specific flow or whatever, just use a client ID. So authorization servers are encouraging the clients to impersonate each other. Or what's happening, it's a pretty bad way to put it, but that's what's happening because there is this limitations that I described. The authorization servers have to spit out the client ID right now. What do? They spit out and allow multiple vendors to use it. So that's my actual, motivation to bring it here because, I'm a bit, I understand why it's happening, but I'm a bit scared that it's happening. So, right. So kind of going back to two questions I posed in the beginning, you might disagree, or maybe I might missing something, but probably four main reasons why client ID is actually needed, why it was in, 47, 67, 49. I don't know why I keep saying 47 today. So tying client ID to the list of allowed redirect URIs to prevent open redirects. So, knowing which client metadata to use, knowing what metadata to display, how to customize user experience if it's, per client. And AS can also apply specific permissions, I guess, based on, identifying which client you're talking to. So next steps, again, just a suggestion. I want to, hear people's thoughts. Can we, as I already, I guess, went ahead of myself, I really want the working group to kind of, encourage working on this, mechanism where we can combine this client metadata idea, which is this individual draft Tobias submitted, and maybe mechanism in Open Federation. And also actually important point we wanted to highlight is OAS 2.1 actually already relaxes the requirements I pointed out in the beginning of this presentation. OAS 2.1 already relaxes that AS has to be the one spitting out, but I think that has happened without, a big working group discussion. I think Torsten acknowledged that it was kind of, the editor's decision. So again, kind of bringing up this, the working group is actually aware, and that is being a conscious decision by the working group that we are relaxing that. Wow, 5 people. Should I be scared or happy?
Yeah. Go ahead, Aaron.
Yeah, I got a lot of notes here. Okay. Let me start with the OAuth 2.1 thing, since that was the last thing you mentioned. Yeah, you are correct that the language got already changed in 2.1, and it says it may also serve clients whose client identifier was issued by a trusted third party. That's the new text. And I actually, now having thought this through a little more, I think we should go one step further and remove the word trusted from that, since it could be issued by other parties for various reasons that are all legitimate in different scenarios. So I think we should go even farther with that. Which also brings up an interesting point that the security BCP also says that clients should not influence their own client ID. And that's for a particular reason that has nothing to do with this, but that was for the case where a resource server might be confusing this subclaim for a client authentication issued token versus a delegated token. So that's an interesting sort of wrench to throw in there, because I think that is still a valid concern, but I think the recommendation that clients shouldn't influence their own client ID is not the right recommendation based on what we're seeing now. Okay. I also wanted, back to the beginning of your presentation, another example use case of a scenario that leverages this is the whole world of completely open web, where there is no trust chain available or desired. And that would be things like random person spins up their own WordPress website. It's open source software. They install it themselves. The developer of WordPress has no idea that it's happened, obviously. Another random developer makes an iPhone app that they publish in the store to edit your WordPress site. Obviously, the developer of the iPhone app has no prior knowledge of every place WordPress is installed, nor is that desirable, and vice versa. So in that case, you actually want the WordPress iPhone app to be able to present itself to an individual's own WordPress website and say, please, I need a token, I need to log in. And I think this is, again, it's the same scenario where you want information about the client, you want some level of redirect URI registration somehow, but you can't even do the trust chain thing because there is no trusted root in that ecosystem. So, and along those lines, there is also a community that I am involved in that has been doing exactly that since about 2014. So it's not even new. So it's like 8 years of client IDs as URLs, and it has been working, and actually kind of widely deployed. There's a lot of systems that use it. So,
Can you say more about this? Like what you
yeah,
said, can
the spec was published as a W3C note in 2018. It's called IndieAuth, and it is essentially a way of using OAuth in that sort of open web ecosystem. I have a blog post that talks about it as well, kind of in terms of looking at it from the OAuth side. I can link that into the Jabber chat or whatever. But it's decently widely implemented, and it does exactly that. Client IDs are URLs. Client metadata is found from that URL. It also happens that the user IDs are URLs too, but that's a different discussion. So I think there's a lot of precedent for that.
Can you post that to the meeting minutes?
I'll put, are you taking notes in the IETF tool? Yeah, I'll put links in there. Cool, that's all.
That was
Thanks,
a lot.
Aaron.
Thank you so much. That was really helpful.
Yeah, Brian.
Would you go back just one slide?
Yep.
I think,
I lost control, so if you
oh, well, it's maybe not important.
actually, I regained it.
Well, just for context, I think it was what is client ID used for or needed for. And I think one piece that was missing from that list is it's often used for part of the record of the granted authorization at the authorization server. That's how it keeps track of, you know, what an individual user granted certain access to a particular client. And so
Right.
It's a consideration I think needs to be considered.
Which slide?
I think that
yeah,
this
why is
one,
client
this
ID
one, yeah,
needed?
Yeah.
That's sort of client ID associated with the record of the authorization, what's often called the underlying grant or the authorization grant, is something that I think pretty much every real authorization server does. So should be included in this, so it's not missed.
Okay. I see someone disagreeing, but I think yeah. Thanks, Brian. I think the point of the slide, and sorry, I kind of didn't talk through, is yeah, if we can identify why client ID is needed and kind of use the list to analyze, you know, to say that even if we allow this client ID as a URI or bring your own client ID model, you can still use client ID for these reasons. So it's okay. Like that was kind of why I actually wanted this checklist to be here, because if we can check all that, like why not, right? So yeah, thanks. Like I think, yeah, no, this list definitely has to be revised.
Daryl Miller. Apologies to the rest of the room as one team at Microsoft talks to another team at Microsoft. I think this would be absolutely wonderful. We have so many issues in developer experience around that initial app registration. And this would allow us to significantly simplify onboarding of people using APIs. It also has an interesting effect. We have a lot of concerns around garbage collection, around app IDs that have been created and then never deleted, and around the consent issue. Maybe it's not such a bad thing if an app ID that hasn't been used in 3 months, that has a consent assigned to it, goes away and the user has to reconsent afterwards. But it is something that we should include and discuss. But yeah, I'm very supportive of heading in this direction.
I'm so happy to hear that.
Yeah. Could you explain for the minutes, like what is the, when you say consent issue, what do you mean by that?
I think the word used was grant. So we store when somebody attempts to go get a token to be able to access a certain piece of data, there are scopes that are in the scope claims in the token that the user says, yes, I would like this app to be able to access my email. Yes, I would like this app to be able to access my contacts. And so we have to store that information along with what we call service principal, but it's associated to the app ID indirectly. So the client ID, sorry, Microsoft terminology.
Thank you.
No, this is great.
You got it. You got it. Just a sec. Hannes, you got it? Okay. Yeah, okay. Justin.
Hi, Justin Richards. So a lot of what's on this slide is actually, I would posit, not about client ID, but about the underlying client registration record as known per the per the AS, and that is what is being referenced by the client ID. That actually further goes to what Brian was just saying, and why I was shaking my head about it, is that you don't need a client ID in order to tie to audit records. You need to link to some database row number somewhere, and that is not a value that needs to be exposed externally to the protocol, generally speaking. However, in the OAuth world, the entire OAuth protocol is basically, you start with the authorization code flow, right? Everything else is just kind of bolted on in strange angles from there. And in the authorization code flow, as it was classically defined, you had to start with a redirect as you were going through the front channel. When you're going through the front channel, you cannot make an authenticated call to the authorization endpoint, or at least you couldn't at the time. I know there's like, you can do it sideways with signed JOTs and things like that these days. But we needed a way to identify what client we were talking about without authenticating the client software itself. So that's where the client ID really came into play. We ended up leaning on the client ID so hard that we had to invent a whole other set of specifications to get a client ID when you didn't have one. That's the dynamic registration side of things, right? And as you've pointed out, very, very rightfully here, there's a whole bunch of use cases where you start collecting all of these client IDs that maybe you'll never see them again, because are you going to really dynamically register every time your SPA reloads or you drop the cookie jar? I know people who tried to do that back in the day because that was the only way they could get around things. It makes absolutely no sense. There are other ways that we should be able to bootstrap this trust environment into the registration record, ephemeral or otherwise, at the AS, and client ID is not the way that we should have done it. All of that said, that is the mechanism that OAuth 2 has, because everything else assumes the client ID will be there, and if it's not there, a lot of stuff actually breaks. So yeah, I think that a lot of this is interesting. I will also add, though, that if you add pushed authorization requests into the mix of possible things, a lot of those problems go away too, because you now can start talking about an external identifier to that ongoing request that is not necessarily tied to a specific client, external client identifier within the scope of the protocol itself. You are simply saying, I am doing the next bit of this part of the protocol here. So if you're doing PAR, if you are doing, key-based authentication and stuff like that, you don't actually technically need client ID at all in OAuth, except that OAuth requires it. That's not a requirement we're going to get away from in OAuth 2 anytime soon. I think that the new language in 2.1 is a good step in that direction. But anyway, this is a very long way to say this is, I think, good and interesting work. I do think, however, we need to really think about this in terms of the client record, as opposed to, or the client registration, or the client something, as opposed to the client ID, because we're using client ID as the stand-in for all of those different things.
Can I quickly react?
Yeah.
So great points. Just to react. So that's why in the question I had both client ID and client metadata. So agree on your first point, but just to clarify, the reason why I didn't put the term registration per se is because I don't think when the client is bringing in its own metadata, it's actually a registration. It's more of, it didn't feel like the right terminology. Like, so that's the only thing. So maybe if you can find, if it's a record or whatnot, a good term, like I would be happy. Yeah.
So yeah, I just to respond, I would agree with that. Actually, registration is sort of very narrowly defined in the OAuth world to mean this: I give you a bunch of metadata, you give me a client ID. That's the transaction. So yeah, I agree. That's not what's happening here.
Right. Okay. And on PAR, that's exactly true. But there are also deployment models where you can't do PAR.
Yep, absolutely.
So like if we can, like account for that, but also, so PAR is great, but there are also cases when it can be used. What do we do in those cases is, if we can discuss, it would be great.
We have 1 minute, so I want to give people a chance to talk here. Tobias. Go ahead, Tobias.
We can see you.
Sorry, are you able to hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Cool. Yeah, I just wanted to throw some strong support in for this work. Obviously have done some work myself in this area that was published to the mailing list yesterday on client discovery. I think much of the language around original OAuth2 and what we have seen in deployment subsequently kind of reflect that, you know, the traditional pre-registered model and assignment of client IDs by the AS is limiting, and the ability for the client to effectively have an identifier that I would posit in reference to the OAuth 2.1 language that might not even be assigned by a third party, but might in fact be self-attested. So I would even consider going further in the context of something like OAuth 2.1 and considering not just third party assignment, but also self assignment, like if a client can do such a thing. I also agree that I don't think when a client is having a client ID where the metadata can be discoverable itself is in fact best described as registration. It's really an attempt for the client to say, this is me, this is how you can get my metadata, and you can enforce whatever policy you would like to on top of that, whether that be, you know, limiting me based on a policy you have as an AS, or proceeding with the transaction based on what you know me as the client. So I would like to get further feedback on at least the draft that we have started today, which is OAuth Client Discovery, that was published to the list, that is conceptually similar to things like OpenID Federation, and all it really does define is a URI, a additional request parameter in OAuth 2 to signal that that client ID is not an AS assigned one that should link to a client record, how to get that metadata document, and some basic validation rules there. Because I also believe with the comment that Aaron made, which is the lowest level here shouldn't be focused on third-party attestations about the client, should be probably just about how the client has a metadata document, how it can be resolved, how those kind of rules work in OAuth 2. Then further client authentication requirements or trust signals and establishing who the client is can be layered in on top of that mechanism. Thanks.
Okay, thanks, Tobias. John, let's wrap it up.
Okay, I'll be short. So Christina, your lobbying has been noted by the OpenID Federation editors. I will point out that I think there may be a misperception that OpenID Federation requires some monolithic global roots. There's nothing that stops a client from being its own root. I mean, that's a policy decision. So you could have an infinite number of roots and everybody could just be their own root if that was the kind of federation you wanted. So nothing actually stops you from doing that.
Right, but that's when I would lobby to rename the spec, because federation consisting of one entity is not intuitively federation.
Nothing says, I mean, yes, I know you don't like the name, but many people understand what federation is, and trying to convince universities and governments that it's called something else. That's probably not a discussion for here, but there doesn't need, you know, there can be an infinite number of roots supported by federation.
Okay,
that's
thank you,
a great
John.
point.
And we passed the time. Thank you, Christina. Appreciate that. The great discussion. Let's continue that discussion on the mailing list. Thank you all, and see you tomorrow on the side meeting. Thanks. 2.
And have a look at the meeting minutes. Some of you spoke so fast that it's really difficult to capture everything. Yes, Justin, you are one of them. I have a lot to say. Yeah, I know.
I just spent 2 months debugging client IDs from database record for this client, and so I have very strong feelings about this. So,